It was a chilly Tuesday evening, and as the sun began to set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the gym parking lot, I pulled my jacket a little tighter around myself. The warmth inside the gym was welcome as I stepped in, greeted by the familiar hum of weights clinking and machines in motion. I headed to the back room where I knew Victor, my trainer, would be finishing up his last session. At 65, Victor defied every stereotype. His physique was lean but muscular, with silver hair that complemented his intense, focused gaze. The gym was his life, and he commanded respect not just from his clients but from everyone who knew him. Over the weeks, our training sessions had evolved into something more than the standard trainer-client dynamic. There was a quiet understanding between us, a sense of being seen, perhaps even appreciated, in ways I hadn't felt in a long time. I noticed the small gestures, like when he handed me a water bottle before I could ask for one, or when he adjusted my posture with a guiding touch on my shoulder that lingered just a moment too long. Today's session was no different. We went through a rigorous routine, Victor pushing me to my limits, his voice steady and encouraging. As we wrapped up, he handed me a towel, and I caught the briefest hint of a smile as our eyes met. The gym was nearly empty now, save for the hum of the heater in the background. "Good work," he said, his voice warm and slightly hoarse. "You've made a lot of progress." He gave my shoulder a firm pat that felt more intimate than it should have, lingering just a second too long. "Thanks, Victor," I replied, trying to steady my breathing. "I don't think I could have done it without you." He nodded, his gaze intense, before glancing away. "Would you like some tea?" "I keep a thermos in my office." His question seemed spontaneous, almost as if he hadn't intended to ask. It caught me off guard, but I nodded, curious. In his small office, Victor poured 2 cups of tea from his thermos, and we settled into a comfortable silence. The room was quiet, the only light coming from the small desk lamp that cast a soft glow over the two of us. I noticed the quiet strength in his hands, the way he held his cup with care. His gaze softened as he looked at me, and I felt an unexpected surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the tea. "You're dedicated," he said, breaking the silence. "I see a lot of people come through here, but you're different." I met his gaze, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. It's easy when you have someone who believes in you. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, an emotion I couldn't quite place. His hand reached out, brushing against mine as he set his cup down. The touch was fleeting, but it left a lingering warmth that sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment, neither of us moved, both caught in the unspoken tension that had been building between us for weeks. The space between us felt charged, electric. I could feel my heart beating faster, and as if drawn by an invisible force, I took a small step closer to him. Victor began, his voice barely a whisper, but he didn't finish his sentence. Instead, he reached out, his hand grazing my cheek. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as if he was testing the boundaries of what was allowed. The air between us grew thick with anticipation, and I felt myself leaning into his touch, my breath catching in my throat. The world outside seemed to disappear as he closed the small distance between us, his hand sliding to the back of my neck as his thumb traced a gentle line along my jaw. The tenderness in his touch surprised me, a stark contrast to the intensity I'd seen in him during our training sessions. It was as if he was holding a secret he'd been waiting to share, and now, in the quiet of his office, he was finally letting it out. Our eyes met, and I felt the weight of every unspoken word, every lingering glance and subtle touch, come crashing down. His lips hovered inches from mine, and I could feel the warmth of his breath as he paused, giving me a moment to pull away if I wanted. But I didn't. "Victor," I whispered, barely able to find my voice. With a soft sigh, he closed the gap between us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both gentle and intense, filled with a depth of emotion that caught me off guard. His hands were warm and steady as they slid to my waist, pulling me closer. I felt myself melting into his embrace, all the tension, all the unspoken desires unraveling as we lost ourselves in the moment. The kiss deepened, and I could feel the months of restraint, of quiet admiration, giving way to something undeniable. His hands roamed across my back, fingers tracing soft patterns that sent shivers through me. It was a moment suspended in time, a quiet surrender to the feelings we had both tried so hard to ignore. When we finally pulled away, his forehead rested against mine, both of us catching our breath. His eyes searched mine, and I could see the mix of emotions swirling within him: desire, tenderness, a hint of uncertainty. "We shouldn't," he murmured, his voice barely audible, but there was no conviction behind his words. "I know," I replied softly, my hand still resting on his shoulders, but neither of us made a move to pull away. We stood there in the quiet of his office, the world outside forgotten. It was a moment that felt both forbidden and right, as if we had crossed a line we could never step back from. The warmth of his hands lingered as he gently traced my shoulders, hesitant, as though he wasn't sure whether to retreat or to pull me closer. His touch ignited a sensation in me that felt both thrilling and dangerous, a feeling I hadn't expected to resurface here, in this small office that smelled faintly of tea and old gym bags. "You know," Victor said quietly, his voice almost reverent, "I didn't think this would ever happen." His gaze softened, and his thumb grazed my cheek, warm and rough, as he met my eyes. "But I've thought about it, more than I should." I swallowed, acutely aware of every inch of him near me, feeling the heat radiate between us. "I have too." The words slipped out without hesitation, surprising me with their honesty. The months of longing glances, fleeting touches, moments of laughter between sets they had built up, each one a small stone in a dam of unspoken feelings, finally breaking free. I hadn't realized how deeply I had come to care for him, how much I looked forward to our time together. His hand moved to my shoulder, steady and reassuring. I could feel his hesitation, his awareness of the boundaries we had just crossed. But there was something more in his eyes, a need, perhaps a yearning he had kept guarded, one that felt as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his eyes searching mine, waiting for a cue that this was all right, that we both knew what this meant. His face was inches from mine, his brow creased with the vulnerability I hadn't seen before. For all his strength and resilience, Victor looked almost fragile in that moment, and it made me want him even more. "Yes," I breathed, my voice barely audible, but the weight of the word filled the space between us. I felt my hands slide over his shoulders, the muscles taut beneath my touch, as if even the gentlest movement might break the spell around us. His breath was warm on my skin, and I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me. Then his hands cupped my face, his touch as tender as it was certain. He drew me closer, slowly, his eyes lingering on my lips before he leaned in, pressing his mouth to mine with a tenderness that surprised me. It wasn't just the kiss itself, it was the way his fingers traced my jaw, as though he was memorizing every contour. The kiss deepened, each touch building on the last, a crescendo of quiet intensity. I felt my pulse quicken as his hand moved to my back, pulling me closer until there was nothing between us. The taste of tea lingered on his lips, and the moment felt surreal, like something I had only dreamed of in quiet moments. His arms wrapped around me, and the world outside his office melted away, leaving just the two of us. My fingers found their way to the nape of his neck, tracing gentle circles as our breathing synced, each breath mingling with the other's. He pulled away slightly, his forehead pressed against mine, his breath ragged. His hand reached up to brush a strand of hair from my face, his touch as gentle as the look in his eyes. I never thought I'd feel this way, at my age. He gave a small, almost self-conscious smile, the kind that made my heart clench with the quiet vulnerability it revealed. "Age has nothing to do with this," I whispered, my fingers still tracing slow patterns along his shoulder. "It's everything else." I struggled to find the words, but he seemed to understand, his hand covering mine, grounding me in that moment. We were caught in something larger than ourselves, an unexpected intimacy that went beyond the physical. As he looked at me, his eyes darkened with a raw intensity that I hadn't seen before. He leaned in again, his mouth finding mine with a hunger that made my knees weak. His hands slid down my sides, and I felt the firmness of his grip as he pulled me closer, our bodies pressed together. Every touch felt electric, sending shivers down my spine. The weight of what we were doing settled around us, but neither of us wanted to pull back. The quiet restraint we'd held for so long was dissolving, replaced by a need that felt both forbidden and irresistible. He lifted me gently, guiding me to sit on the edge of his desk, his hands firm on my hips, grounding me in the whirlwind of sensations. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his voice low and filled with concern. His fingers brushed over my back, gentle and reassuring, a stark contrast to the intensity in his gaze. "Yes," I whispered, meeting his eyes, feeling a surge of warmth course through me. The care in his touch, the way he was so attuned to every small detail, made the moment feel all the more intimate. I reached up, my fingers trailing along the line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of his stubble beneath my fingertips. The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air thickening with a tension that neither of us wanted to break. His hands moved to my lower back, pressing me closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the strength in his arms as he held me steady. My heart pounded as he leaned in, his mouth trailing down my neck, each kiss sending waves of warmth through me. "I've wanted this for so long," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, as though admitting it out loud might shatter the moment. I felt a rush of emotions, desire, affection, and an undeniable connection that had been building since the first day I walked into the gym. The minutes that followed blurred together, each touch, each whispered word a testament to the intensity of our bond. His hands explored my back, tracing lines of heat over my skin as his mouth found mine again, deeper and more fervent than before. I could feel his heartbeat against my chest, fast and unsteady, mirroring my own. As we sat there, lost in each other, I felt the weight of what this meant, the realization that there would be no going back. This wasn't just a fleeting moment or a mistake, it was something that had been building, an unspoken connection that had finally come to light. When we finally pulled away, his hands resting on my waist, there was a look in his eyes that mirrored my own, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and uncertainty. His fingers traced small circles on my back, grounding me as we sat in the quiet aftermath of what had just happened. "What now?" I asked softly, barely able to find my voice, afraid to break the fragile silence between us. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything we had just shared. "I don't know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But whatever it is, I don't want this to end." I felt my heart swell at his words, the quiet assurance in his voice filling me with a sense of warmth and certainty. We stayed there for a while longer, wrapped in each other's arms, both knowing that whatever lay ahead, we had crossed a line that could never be undone. The stillness enveloped us as we sat there, breathing in sync, neither of us ready to let go. Victor's arms remained around me, anchoring me in a way that made me feel both safe and vulnerable, as if he alone could steady the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. In the quiet that followed, I realized just how deeply I'd craved this closeness. Months of shared glances and whispered encouragement had finally culminated in this moment, and I felt as though I was rediscovering parts of myself I'd long forgotten. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Victor murmured, his voice soft, almost reverent. His fingers traced gentle patterns along my back, each movement deliberate, tender. His eyes met mine, and I saw a glimmer of vulnerability that surprised me, a glimpse of the man beneath the trainer, someone who carried his own stories, his own regrets. Neither did I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I found myself studying his face, tracing the lines that told stories of resilience and strength, the faint scars on his hands, the wisdom in his eyes. In that moment, I felt like I was seeing Victor for the first time, not as my trainer, but as someone whose life had woven itself quietly into mine. For a while, we remained like that, content in the warmth of each other's presence. The world outside seemed to melt away, leaving just the two of us in the intimate cocoon of his office. But as the silence stretched on, reality began to creep back in. I felt a pang of guilt, a reminder of the complexities waiting beyond these walls, of the boundaries we'd blurred. We need to talk about this," Victor finally said, breaking the silence. His hand moved to my shoulder, a grounding touch, as he searched my face. "I don't want to do anything that could hurt you." I nodded, feeling a knot of apprehension settle in my chest. I knew he was right, as much as I didn't want this moment to end. We couldn't ignore the implications. There was an unspoken understanding between us that what had just happened was more than just an impulsive act. It was the beginning of something that, if we chose to pursue it, would change everything. "I know," I replied softly, "but I also know that I don't want to pretend this didn't happen." He looked at me, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity, as though he was weighing each word before speaking. "I feel the same," he admitted, his thumb brushing over my hand. "I didn't realize how much I needed this, to feel connected." I felt a surge of emotion at his words, a sense of relief that he shared my hesitation, my longing. The room seemed to close in around us, wrapping us in a quiet, shared intimacy that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "We'll take it slow," he said finally, his voice steady, reassuring. "No rush, no pressure. Just see where this goes." I nodded, a weight lifting from my shoulders. There was something comforting in his words, a sense that whatever happened next, we would face it together. The tension that had built up between us over the months seemed to dissolve, replaced by a quiet certainty that for now this was enough. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead, and I felt my heart swell at the simple, tender gesture. It was as though he was sealing a promise, a vow to navigate whatever lay ahead with patience and care. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his lips against my skin, the steady beat of his heart beneath my hand. When he pulled back, his fingers lingered on my cheek, his gaze soft but determined. "Let's meet outside of here. Just you and me," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "I think it's time we got to know each other beyond the gym." I felt a smile spreading across my face, a giddy thrill bubbling up within me at the thought. "I'd like that," I replied, my voice filled with more certainty than I'd felt in a long time. In that moment, the idea of exploring this connection, of seeing where it might lead, filled me with a sense of anticipation, a quiet joy that felt like rediscovering a part of myself I'd lost. As we gathered ourselves, the atmosphere shifted, a newfound ease settling between us. We shared a lingering glance, a silent acknowledgement of the journey we were about to embark on, one filled with uncertainty and promise. He walked me to the door, his hand warm against the small of my back, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the kindness, the patience, the quiet strength he'd shown. In the doorway, we paused, sharing one last look, a final moment suspended in time. "Good night," he said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness that lingered in the air even after I stepped into the cool evening. The chill wrapped around me, but I barely felt it, my thoughts still back in that small, dimly lit office. The days that followed felt different. Each time I walked into the gym, I was acutely aware of Victor's presence, the unspoken connection we now shared. We hadn't yet planned our first official time together outside of training, but there was a quiet understanding between us, a subtle shift in our interactions that felt charged with anticipation. Our sessions became a dance, each movement a brushstroke on a canvas we were painting together. His touch felt different now, more intentional, each correction and adjustment a reminder of the intimacy we'd shared. We exchanged glances, subtle smiles that spoke volumes, the quiet thrill of knowing that soon we would step outside the familiar walls of the gym and explore this connection in the real world. Finally, the day arrived. He had suggested a quiet cafe in the heart of the city, a place where he said he often went to think I arrived a few minutes early, nerves fluttering in my stomach as I scanned the cozy, warmly lit space. When he walked in, his face softened as our eyes met, and I felt my heart skip a beat. We settled into a small table near the window, the world outside a blur as we immersed ourselves in conversation. Victor shared stories from his life, his journey from a young athlete to a trainer, the sacrifices he'd made, the dreams he'd let go. I listened, captivated by the depth of his experiences, the resilience that had shaped him into the man he was. In turn, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years, sharing pieces of my own story, my fears, my aspirations. There was an ease between us, a natural rhythm that made me feel as though we'd known each other far longer than a few months. Each word, each shared laugh and lingering glance felt like another thread weaving us closer together. As the evening wore on, the world around us faded into the background, leaving just the two of us lost in our own little universe. I felt a deep sense of contentment, a quiet joy that settled in my chest, and I realized that with Victor I didn't have to pretend. I could simply be myself. When the cafe began to empty, he reached across the table, his hand covering mine, and I felt a shiver run through me at the warmth of his touch. It feels right, he murmured, his gaze intense, searching. Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The words hung between us, a simple acknowledgement of the truth we had both known but hadn't dared to speak. It did feel right, in a way that transcended logic or reason, as if we were meant to find each other in this quiet corner of the world. He walked me home, his hand resting gently on my back, guiding me through the darkened streets. When we reached my door, we paused, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I looked up at him, and for a moment everything else faded away, the doubts, the uncertainties, the complications. There was only this moment, only us. "Good night," he said softly, his voice a low murmur that sent a warmth spreading through me. "Good night," I replied, my voice filled with a quiet longing that mirrored his own. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead, and I felt my heart flutter at the tenderness in his touch. His lips lingered, and for a brief moment I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth, the gentle pressure. It was a promise, a vow to explore whatever this was, wherever it might lead. As I watched him walk away, a sense of peace settled over me. We were beginning something that felt both fragile and profound, an unexpected connection that had taken root quietly, growing in the shared silences, the subtle touches, the stolen glances. I didn't know what lay ahead, but in that moment I felt ready to find out, knowing that whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. For the first time in a long while, the world felt bright with possibilities, and as I stepped into my apartment, a soft smile touched my lips. In the weeks that followed, our connection blossomed in ways that felt both inevitable and exhilarating. Victor and I began meeting more frequently, each time peeling back new layers of ourselves. Our moments together grew more intimate, more meaningful, whether it was the way he reached for my hand while we walked, or the quiet dinners where we shared stories and laughter that seemed to echo long after we'd parted. Each time we met, the attraction, the depth of feeling only intensified. I had never felt this alive, this deeply connected. We had crossed a line, yes, but the bond that was forming between us made that line feel irrelevant, insignificant against the reality of what we had found. One night, after a particularly grueling training session, we ended up back in his apartment, a cozy, modest space filled with books and photos that captured glimpses of the life he'd built. The city lights spilled in through the windows, casting a soft glow over the room. As he poured us each a glass of wine, I felt a familiar warmth, an unspoken understanding that we were reaching a turning point, a place where our connection could no longer be contained within stolen moments and secret meetings. "Do you ever wonder how all of this happened?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. I glanced at him, feeling a flush rise to my cheeks, but he only smiled, setting his glass aside as he moved closer, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Every day," he replied, his voice low, filled with a warmth that made my heart ache. "And yet, it feels like it was always meant to happen." In that moment, I felt all the remaining walls between us dissolve. His arms circled around me, and he drew me in, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was deeper, more vulnerable than any we had shared before. His hands moved over me with a tenderness that took my breath away, as if he was memorizing every inch of me, capturing this moment in his mind. The night unfolded slowly, each touch, each shared breath building on the last, until we were both lost in each other, surrendering to the pull that had drawn us together. It was more than just desire, it was a connection that felt profound, a meeting of souls that transcended words or explanations. When the morning light filtered in through the window, casting a soft glow over the room, I found myself wrapped in his arms, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm against my back. I lay there, feeling the weight of his presence, a quiet assurance that, despite the uncertainties, this was where I was meant to be. He stirred, his arm tightening around me as he pressed a kiss to my shoulder, his breath warm against my skin. "Are you okay?" he murmured, his voice filled with a gentle concern that made my heart swell. "Yes," I replied, turning to meet his gaze. "More than okay." We lay there for a while, wrapped in the warmth of each other, both of us basking in the quiet intimacy that had become our sanctuary. But as the reality of the day settled over us, I felt a flicker of uncertainty, a reminder that this connection, as beautiful as it was, came with challenges we couldn't ignore. As we shared a quiet breakfast, Victor reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "We'll figure this out," he said softly, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Whatever it takes." I nodded, a sense of calm settling over me at his words. I knew there would be challenges, moments of doubt, but I also knew that I had found something rare, something worth fighting for. With Victor by my side, I felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, knowing that our bond, our love, would guide us through. And so as I walked out of his apartment that morning, the sun rising over the city, I felt a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for so long. This was only the beginning, a journey that would unfold with each step, each shared moment, each heartbeat. As I stepped into the cool morning air, a soft smile played on my lips. This was more than just a romance, it was a partnership, a shared understanding that went beyond the physical. Together we would face whatever came our way, knowing that, no matter the obstacles, we had found something worth holding on to. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real, raw, and filled with promise. And for now, that was enough.